This is my true story. I raised my son with love, care, and sacrifice. But one afternoon, in the middle of a crowded supermarket, he kicked my wheelchair away from him, as if I was nothing. People stared, and he laughed. I felt humiliated in a way I cannot describe. That moment changed everything. I decided I would never let him have power over me again. And the very next day, I did something that brought him on his knees. And I vanished. Before I tell you exactly how I did it, comment if you love your children more than anything, and please subscribe so my stories reach more people. I was not born into comfort. I was born into work. As a girl, I woke before dawn to sweep floors and carry buckets. As a teenager, I took shifts no one wanted, so the light bill stayed paid. When I became a mother, I made a vow that my son would never feel that same fear of empty cupboards. I promised he would grow with shoes that fit, notebooks that were new, and a bed that did not shake when trucks passed at night. I worked for that promise every day. I cleaned offices until my back burned. I scrubbed steps until my fingers split. I took weekend shifts in a bakery and came home smelling of yeast and smoke. I counted coins in a small tin and pushed them across the counter for his school fees. When he needed uniforms, I found a second job. When he needed books, I wore the old coat one more winter. I was tired most nights, but the tired felt honest. It felt like love that moved brick by brick. He was a bright boy, quick with numbers and jokes. I cheered at school assemblies. I packed lunches with little notes inside, even when my shift ended at midnight. I sat through parent meetings in worn shoes and kept my chin high. When he had a fever, I held him upright so he could breathe and slept sitting in a chair. When boys mocked his old backpack, I patched it from the inside so the stitches did not show. He asked, "Are we poor?" I said, "We are building." That answer was true. The years moved, and so did the bills. He tried small jobs and quit a few. I did not shame him. I told him to try again. When he wanted a course to learn computers, I paid the fee in 3 parts and smiled like it was easy. When he crashed a scooter, I handled the repair. When his debts grew, I met the bank, set a plan, and made the first payment. He met a kind girl and brought her home. I cooked a simple meal. I wanted her to feel welcome, to know she was safe with us. When they decided to marry, I paid for the hall, the food, the music, and the small gold chain her mother wished for. I did it gladly. I told my son, "Start life without debt. Start life with hope." He hugged me hard. I cried alone in the kitchen. After the wedding, they searched for a place. Rents were high and loans were heavy. I remembered the dream I had saved in my heart for years. I wanted him to have a home that could not be taken by late fees or a bad month, so I bought a house. I chose one with sun across the front room and a strong roof. I checked pipes myself. I asked neighbors about water and noise. I bargained hard and paid in full from saving, small inheritances, and years of overtime. I placed the keys in his palm and said, "This is your start." His eyes filled. He said, "It is my house." I said, "It is our family's house. One day I will put your name on the paper. For now, build your life." He and his wife painted the bedroom a soft color and sent me photos. I brought curtains and a kettle. I planted basil in a pot by the kitchen window. I folded towels and stacked them neat. I wanted every corner to feel cared for. When work was slow for him, I slipped money into a card and wrote, "For rainy days." When their fridge failed, I called a repairman and paid him before they got home. I tried to be a quiet blessing in the background. I believed he would remember each bill I lifted, each door I opened with a mop in one hand and hope in the other. As my body aged, my steps shortened, but my commitment did not. I learned the cane, then the walker, and finally the wheelchair. I told myself the chair meant freedom, not weakness. It let me move and visit the market on good days. When the doctor increased my pills, I set alarms and kept a notebook with boxes to tick. I did not want to be trouble. I asked for help only when I had to. I kept my room neat. I stayed grateful for small mercies, hot tea and morning light. Through it all, one belief lived in me like breath. Love returns as respect. I thought no matter how hard times grew, my son would speak to me with care. I thought he would see the history in my hands and the years in my eyes. I thought he would remember who stood between him and hunger, who said yes when the world told me to save for myself. I trusted the house I bought would be a place where kindness was the rule. I did not buy that house to hold power over him. I bought it to give him a soft floor to land on and a strong roof to rise under. I imagined birthdays at the table, lights along the balcony, and a cradle near the window. I imagined he would become a man who protected me the way I had protected him. I imagined old age with simple words, "Thank you, Ma," and "Are you comfortable?" Before I learned I was wrong, I was only a devoted mother working, saving, paying, and believing. I built a life with scrub brushes and double shifts. I stitched a safety net from patience and small notes that said it will be okay. I bought a house so my son would never be cold. I trusted respect would meet me where I had met him all his life, halfway, with open hands and a gentle voice. I saved receipts in a folder and dates in a small diary. I kept copies of the deed in a plastic sleeve. I told no one about that detail. I believed trust would be enough. I believed family would hold. I believed my son would always choose respect. I did not imagine a day when those beliefs would be tested in a store with strangers watching. It began so quietly that I almost didn't notice. A word here, a look there. After my health grew weaker and it became harder to manage on my own, my son said, "Why don't you come live with us? It will be easier." I took it as kindness. I thought it meant he wanted me close, that he understood how much I had given, and now it was his turn to make sure I was safe. I moved into the small spare room at the back of the house. I brought my few things, clothes, a photo of his father, my sewing kit, and the little clock that had ticked in our kitchen for decades. At first, I was grateful. I told everyone my boy was looking after me. But slowly, the air in the house changed. The first signs were small. He started speaking to me with less patience, cutting me off in the middle of sentences, answering me with short, sharp words instead of full sentences. He'd sigh when I asked him to repeat something. Sometimes he wouldn't even look at me when I spoke, just stared at his phone or the television. I told myself he was tired from work, stressed maybe, and I shouldn't take it to heart. But those small signs grew into habits. He began deciding what I could and couldn't do, as though I were a child. If I wanted to go outside, he would ask where, why, and for how long. If I wanted to visit an old friend, he'd say it was too much trouble. My outings became fewer. The market trips I used to enjoy turned into rushed errands where he'd push my wheelchair quickly down aisles without letting me look around. I started feeling like a piece of furniture in my own home, something to be moved, not included. Money became another point of control. He told me it was better if he handled my pension so the bills are easier to manage. At first, I agreed, trusting him like I always had. But soon, he started questioning every small thing I bought. If I asked for new shoes, he'd say the old ones were fine. If I wanted a better pillow for my back, he'd call it unnecessary. I began to hide coins in an envelope just so I could buy myself a bar of chocolate without his comments. And then came his voice, sharper, louder, heavier, arguments over nothing. "Why are you sitting there? Don't make a mess. Stop moving things around." Words meant to remind me that I was in his space, not ours. I stayed silent most of the time. Silence was easier than hearing the irritation in his tone. I told myself maybe this was just a bad season. Maybe work was hard or money was tight. I hoped it would pass. His wife followed his lead. She stopped talking to me unless necessary. Meals became something I took in my room. I was no longer part of their dinner conversations. I didn't mind the quiet, but it was the coldness that hurt. They didn't look at me the way family should. They looked through me. like I was invisible until I needed to be moved or spoken to. The house I had bought, the home I thought would be our safe place, began to feel like a cage. I had keys to the front door, but I didn't feel free to use them. Every time I tried to step out, I could feel his eyes following me, measuring my movements. I stopped going out in the evenings because I didn't want to hear him ask why. I kept my room cleaner than a hospital bed so he couldn't complain. I avoided using the kitchen when they were home. I learned the sound of his footsteps so I could stay out of his way. There was no single day when the respect ended. It was chipped away slowly, week after week, until I could barely remember the last time my son had spoken to me with warmth. Sometimes I would sit in my chair and remember the little boy who used to hold my hand so tightly in crowded places. I would think of the way he'd run to me after school, proud of a drawing or a test score, eager for my praise. And I would ask myself, where did that boy go? Did I lose him when I gave him everything he asked for, or did I raise a man who never learned how to give back? Still, I told myself to endure. I didn't want to cause tension. I didn't want to be a burden, even if he already saw me as one. I kept quiet about the hurt. I told my friends, he's busy, but he takes care of me, even when my heart knew it wasn't true. I thought if I just stayed still, avoided arguments, and kept my head down, maybe things would return to how they were in the beginning. But deep inside, I could feel a crack forming. Respect is not something you can force. Once it is gone, you notice the absence in every small interaction. You hear it in the way they close doors a little too hard, in the way they answer without looking at you, in the way they take your presence for granted. And when respect is gone, love feels smaller. It doesn't vanish all at once, but it loses its warmth. I felt that warmth slipping away every day I lived under his roof. By the time the incident in the supermarket happened, my patience had worn thin, but I still had no idea just how far his disrespect would go. I thought I had seen the worst: the cold voice, the watchful eyes, the constant limits on my freedom. I thought that was the end of it. I didn't know that one public moment would shatter any last illusion I had about my place in his life. It was a Thursday morning when I asked him to take me to the supermarket. I had been putting it off for weeks because I didn't want to bother him, but my supply of groceries was low, and I needed a few personal items I couldn't get through his online shopping. I thought maybe the trip would give us a small chance to talk, to be out in public where we could act like the family I remembered. I even dressed a little nicer, a fresh cardigan, my hair combed neatly, and the brooch his father had given me years ago pinned to my chest. When he finally agreed to drive me, it was with a sigh, as though I had asked him to carry a heavy load. The drive was quiet. He didn't play any music, and he kept his eyes on the road without speaking. I tried to make small comments about the weather, about the new cafe I saw had opened on the corner, but he only responded with short, yeah or uh-huh answers. By the time we reached the supermarket, I could already feel the weight of his impatience pressing against me. We went inside, and I took my time in the produce section, picking vegetables that were still fresh and firm. I knew my way around this store. I had shopped there for years before moving into his home. But now, in the wheelchair, I had to rely on him to reach certain shelves. In one aisle, I spotted a jar of my favorite jam on the top shelf. It was just out of reach. I asked him, "Could you please get that for me?" My voice was soft, polite, the way I had always spoken to him. He didn't answer at first. Then he rolled his eyes, muttered something I couldn't catch, and without warning, he placed his foot behind my wheelchair and kicked it forward. It wasn't a gentle nudge. It was a sharp push, sending the chair sliding several feet ahead. My hands gripped the armrests hard, my body jolting forward. The movement startled me so much that my heart pounded in my chest. I heard a gasp from someone nearby. The sudden motion made me feel exposed, like every eye in the aisle had turned toward me. My legs are weak. I can't stop the chair quickly on my own. I fumbled to pull myself back into position, struggling to turn around and look at him. When I did, he was smirking, as if he had just played a harmless joke. But it didn't feel harmless. It felt like a message that my needs, my comfort, even my dignity meant nothing to him. "Move faster! You're blocking the aisle," he said loudly, his voice carrying so that others could hear. His tone wasn't playful. It was sharp, impatient, and meant to embarrass me. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. Two shoppers nearby looked at me, then quickly looked away. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. In that moment, I wanted the floor to open beneath me. I had been humiliated before, but never in a way that made me feel so powerless. My hands shook as I tried to maneuver the chair back to the shelf. I wanted to tell him to stop, to ask why he would do something like that, but my throat felt tight. If I spoke, I knew my voice would break, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing my tears. I stayed quiet, pretending as if nothing had happened, but inside, a storm was building. I kept shopping, slowly placing items into the basket on my lap, each movement heavier than the last. The stares of strangers followed me down the aisles, or maybe I just imagined them. It didn't matter. The damage was done. I felt smaller, weaker, and more alone than I ever had. By the time we reached the checkout line, I was numb. He unloaded the items without looking at me, tapping his phone as if I wasn't even there. When we got back to the car, he didn't offer to help me in. He just waited, tapping the steering wheel impatiently until I managed to get myself inside. The ride home was silent. I stared out the window, my reflection in the glass looking older, more tired, and strangely unfamiliar. That day in the supermarket didn't just bruise my pride. It tore open something inside me, a realization I had been avoiding for too long. I saw clearly that my son no longer saw me as his mother, as the woman who had raised him, protected him, and sacrificed for him. To him, I was just another task, another inconvenience, and he had no problem showing that to the world. When we arrived home, I went straight to my room. I closed the door and sat in the stillness, my hands resting in my lap. I replayed the moment over and over, the kick, the slide, the laughter. I thought of the faces of the strangers in the aisle. Some looked curious, some awkward, but none of them looked at me with kindness. It struck me that no one had even asked if I was okay. I told myself I would never let him do that to me again. I didn't know how yet, but I knew something had shifted. This wasn't just disrespect anymore, it was cruelty. And cruelty, I decided, didn't deserve the loyalty I had been giving him all these years. The moment in that supermarket aisle didn't end when the wheels of my chair stopped moving. It stayed with me, clinging like a cold shadow that refused to leave. Even as I tried to keep my head down, the weight of eyes on me was unbearable. People had seen it. They had witnessed my own son, my flesh and blood, treat me like a nuisance, like an object in his way rather than a human being. And yet, no one stepped in. Not a single person asked if I needed help or if I was all right. It was as though my embarrassment was something they didn't want to touch, something contagious. I sat there in the middle of the aisle for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, pretending to adjust the blanket over my knees so I wouldn't have to look up. My hands were trembling, but I told myself to move. I forced my chair back into position and reached for the nearest item on the shelf, even though it wasn't what I needed. My son's voice broke through the ringing in my ears, sharp, impatient, and deliberately loud. "Move faster, you're blocking the aisle." The words hit harder than the kick. There was no kindness left in his tone, no trace of the boy who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. It was a command, a dismissal, a public declaration that I was nothing but an obstacle. My throat tightened, and my eyes burned. I could feel the sting of tears threatening to fall, but I swallowed them back. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry here, not in front of strangers who were already staring at me like I was part of a scene they couldn't wait to forget. I rolled forward, keeping my eyes fixed on the shelves, focusing on the labels so I wouldn't have to meet anyone's gaze. I moved slowly, partly because my hands were still shaking and partly because I didn't trust myself to speak without breaking down. Every squeak of the wheelchair's wheels echoed like a reminder of how far I had fallen from the days when I could walk these aisles freely, strong and independent. The rest of the trip was torture. He walked ahead of me most of the time, never once turning to check if I was managing. If I asked for something on a higher shelf, he either ignored me or grabbed it with a quick, careless movement, tossing it into the basket like it was a chore he wanted over with. There was no conversation, no patience, just silence filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional sigh from him when I didn't move quickly enough. When we reached the checkout line, I stayed in the chair while he unloaded the groceries. He didn't say a word to me, didn't ask if I wanted anything else. Instead, he scrolled through his phone, tapping the screen while the cashier scanned our items. I could see the cashier glance at me once or twice, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't say anything either. Maybe she thought it wasn't her place. Maybe no one thinks it's their place to step in when an old woman is humiliated in public by her own child. We paid, bagged the groceries, and left. Outside, the air felt cold against my face, but it didn't wash away the heat of shame burning in my chest. He loaded the bags into the trunk and waited by the driver's side door, making no move to help me into the car. I had to grip the door frame and pull myself up inch by inch, my legs heavy and uncooperative. By the time I was seated, my breathing was uneven, but I stayed silent. If he noticed, he didn't care. The ride home was suffocating. I stared out the window, watching buildings and trees blur past, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. I thought about all the years I had spent teaching him manners, telling him to be kind to others, reminding him that respect is something you give freely, especially to family. I thought about how far we had drifted from those lessons. When we got home, he carried the groceries inside, setting them on the counter without a word. I wheeled myself into my room, closed the door, and let the silence wrap around me. I replayed the supermarket scene again and again in my head, each time feeling the humiliation sink deeper. It wasn't just about the kick or the comment. It was about the way he looked at me, like I was an inconvenience, an anchor dragging down his life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the dark, the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the faint creak of the floorboards when he moved around the house. I thought about the people who had seen it happen, about how their eyes slid away quickly, as though pretending not to see could erase what they had witnessed. I wondered if they would tell someone about it later, maybe as a passing remark. "You should have seen this guy at the store today with his mom." But I knew it wouldn't be told as a story of cruelty. It would just be a moment they forgot by tomorrow. For me, it wouldn't be forgotten. It was etched into me. I had given my life to raising this man, to making sure he had more than I ever did, and in return, he had reduced me to a spectacle, something to be laughed at and dismissed in front of strangers. That day, sitting alone in my room, I realized something important. Humiliation can break a person, but it can also ignite something inside them. And what I felt then wasn't just pain anymore. It was resolve. I decided that I would never let him put me in that position again. The next time I rolled into a supermarket, it would be without him. The next time I moved through this world, it would be on my terms. He had taken my dignity in that aisle, but he had also given me the final push I needed to reclaim my life. What my son never seemed to realize, or maybe had simply forgotten in his arrogance, was that the house he called his own was not his at all. Not legally, not on paper. It was still in my name, from the day I bought it right up to that moment. Years earlier, when he'd been drowning in debt and on the brink of losing everything, I'd stepped in. I paid for the house outright in cash, no mortgage, no liens, no bank breathing down our necks. I told him it was for his future, for stability, so that he could start a family without the weight of rent or loans hanging over him. Back then, I thought keeping the deed in my name was just a formality, something I'd change later when things settled. I never imagined I'd be grateful for that choice. In those early years, he thanked me often. He'd say, "Mom, I don't know what I'd do without you." And he meant it, or at least I believed he did. But as time went on, those words stopped. Gratitude faded into expectation, and expectation hardened into entitlement. He began to act as if the house had always been his, as if my signature on those ownership papers didn't exist, as if my sacrifice was just a forgotten detail in his version of events. Sitting in my room after the supermarket incident, the humiliation still raw, I started to think about that piece of paper, the one locked away in my fireproof box, sitting quietly among old photographs and insurance forms. That deed wasn't just a record of ownership, it was leverage, it was power, and for the first time, I began to see it as my escape. He had no idea I'd never transferred the deed. He'd assumed, like so many things in life, that I'd taken care of it in a way that benefited him. He thought the house was untouchable, a permanent fixture in his life. But legally, he had no claim. If I wanted to, I could sell it in an instant. He couldn't stop me. The law wouldn't side with him. All those years of thinking I was powerless under his roof, they were wrong. It wasn't his roof. It was mine. That realization felt like a door opening. The anger I'd been holding back, the shame I'd swallowed in that store, began to shift into something sharper. Not spite, not yet, but a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I could end this. I could walk, or roll, away from this life without asking for permission, without begging for help. I didn't need to wait for him to change. I didn't need him at all. I thought about what he'd taken from me over the years, not just money, but dignity, independence, peace of mind. I thought about the countless moments I had let slide, the small insults, the controlling tone, the dismissive gestures, and then I thought about how quickly people like him forget who made their comfort possible. He had built his pride on a foundation I had paid for. That made the situation almost poetic. The more I turned it over in my mind, the more I realized that he had underestimated me. He thought I was too old, too dependent, too afraid to make a move. But I had spent my entire life surviving, raising him alone, working long hours, paying bills with coins counted at the kitchen table. I had faced harder challenges than selling a house. The only difference now was that I had nothing left to lose. I didn't tell him any of this. I smiled when he passed me in the hallway, kept my tone even when we exchanged words about dinner or bills. I let him think everything was the same. But in my mind, the decision had already been made. The humiliation at the supermarket had been the final straw. The house was my ticket to freedom, and I was going to use it. That night, I unlocked the fireproof box and took out the deed. I ran my hand over the paper, reading my name printed clearly at the top. It was proof, tangible proof, that I still had control, that I wasn't at his mercy. I slid it into an envelope, placed it carefully in my handbag, and locked the box again. I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time in a long while, I slept without waking in the middle of the night, because now I had a plan. The next morning, I woke up with a steadiness in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was control. Real, undeniable control. I went about my morning routine as usual, so my son wouldn't suspect a thing. I made my tea, buttered my toast, and wheeled myself to the kitchen table like I did every day. He passed by without looking at me, muttering something about needing to leave for work early. Perfect. The less attention he paid, the easier this would be. The moment I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I reached for the phone. Not to call a friend, not to complain, but to make the most important call I'd made in decades. To my lawyer. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment lawyer either. This was the same man who had handled my husband's will, my insurance, and most importantly, the purchase of this very house. He knew every detail of the transaction, and more importantly, he knew my son had never been on the deed. When he picked up, I didn't bother with small talk. "It's time," I told him. There was a pause, then a calm, knowing response. "I'll pull up the paperwork." Within minutes, he confirmed what I already knew. My name was the sole owner listed, not shared, not co-signed, not even a mention of my son anywhere in the legal documentation. That meant I could do what I was about to do without a single roadblock from him. I told my lawyer I wanted the house sold immediately. No drawn-out process, no public listings, no open houses that might tip him off. We needed a fast private cash sale, the kind that could be completed in a day or two. He said he had a trusted buyer in mind, an investor who had purchased properties from him before, someone who wouldn't ask unnecessary questions or create delays. That was exactly what I needed. For the rest of the day, I stayed quiet. I didn't bring up the supermarket incident. I didn't mention the call. I didn't hint at my plans. Instead, I played the role I'd been forced into for years. The quiet, compliant mother who kept to her room and didn't interfere. Every time I saw him pass by my door, every time I heard him laugh into his phone like nothing was wrong, I reminded myself that in just a short time, this entire dynamic would flip on its head. That night, after dinner, I went to my room and began making a list. Not a list of possessions to keep. I already knew I'd only take one suitcase, but a list of accounts, contacts, and arrangements I'd need to make once I was gone. I wrote down the name of the bank where the funds would be transferred, the taxi service I trusted, the airport hotel that was wheelchair accessible. I even noted the small things, medications, extra charger, my favorite sweater for the flight. This wasn't going to be a messy escape. It was going to be clean, precise, and final. Before going to bed, I called my lawyer once more to confirm the buyer was ready. He was. The cash offer was already on the table, and the paperwork would be ready to sign first thing in the morning. He assured me the funds would be wired directly to my personal account, not the joint account my son occasionally snooped through. That was important. I wanted every penny to be mine, untouchable. As I lay in bed that night, the memory of him kicking my wheelchair in that supermarket replayed in my mind. The shock, the sting, the laughter in his voice, it all came rushing back, but instead of tears, I felt resolve. He thought that moment had humiliated me into silence. What he didn't know was that it had lit the fuse, and in less than 24 hours, the explosion would be felt where it hurt him most: his home, his comfort, his sense of security. When I closed my eyes, I pictured the look on his face when he'd find out. Not because I wanted to see him suffer, but because I wanted him to understand one thing. I wasn't trapped. I never was. Morning came, and with it, the kind of calm you only feel when you've already made your decision and there's no turning back. The house was unusually quiet. My son had left early again, probably off to meet friends or run errands. I didn't care where he was. In fact, the less I knew, the better. I rolled into the kitchen, brewed my tea, and sat by the window for a moment, letting the sunlight spill across the table. It struck me then. This might be the last time I'd see this view. The yard I had planted flowers in, the driveway I had paid to repave, the very walls that had been meant to shelter my family. Soon, they would no longer be mine to look after, and I was fine with that. By mid-morning, my lawyer arrived with a briefcase and a stack of papers. He looked at me with quiet respect, not pity, and slid the documents across the table. "Once you sign, the funds will be transferred by 3 p.m. today," he said. My hands didn't tremble as I picked up the pen. I thought they might. After all, this was a house I had bought outright for my son as a wedding gift. A place I had believed would keep him stable and safe. But after what he'd done to me, I didn't feel sadness signing it away. I felt free. Each signature was like cutting another tie that had been holding me in place for far too long. By the time I reached the last page, there was no hesitation left. The lawyer double-checked the details, gathered the documents, and made a call to the buyer right there in my kitchen. Within minutes, it was done. The sale was complete. The money was already in motion. I was no longer the owner of this house, but I was the owner of my future. After the lawyer left, I began packing. Not everything, just the essentials. One suitcase, clothes, a few personal papers, medications, and small keepsakes that meant something to me. Things that couldn't be replaced. I left behind furniture, decorations, appliances. All of it would belong to someone else now. The emptiness in the suitcase wasn't a sign of loss. It was a sign of how little I actually needed. Around noon, I received the confirmation text from my bank. The funds had been deposited. A 7-figure sum, untouchable, mine alone. I stared at that number for a long moment, not out of greed, but out of quiet satisfaction. This was what security looked like. Not a house with a roof that sheltered disrespect, but the ability to live anywhere I chose without depending on anyone. The rest of the day was about timing. I didn't want him to know anything until it was far too late to stop me. I arranged for a taxi to arrive at 2 a.m., late enough that he'd be asleep, early enough to get to the airport before morning traffic. I booked my one-way ticket to a small coastal city overseas, the kind of place where no one knew my name, where the air smelled like salt water and freedom. That evening, my son came home. He didn't notice the packed suitcase tucked in the corner of my room. He didn't ask about my day, and I didn't offer anything. We shared a silent dinner, the air thick with unspoken words. He scrolled on his phone between bites, laughing at things I couldn't hear. I kept my eyes on my plate, every so often glancing at the clock, counting down the hours. By the time he went to bed, I was already dressed and ready. I sat in my wheelchair in the dark, listening to the slow rhythm of the house settling for the night. I could hear his footsteps upstairs, then the sound of his bedroom door closing. After that, nothing. Just silence, the kind that told me it was time. When my phone buzzed with the taxi driver's arrival, I rolled quietly through the hallway, past the photos on the wall, past the living room where we'd once celebrated birthdays and holidays. I didn't linger. I didn't look back. By the time the front door clicked shut behind me, I felt lighter than I had in years. This was the last time I'd ever step foot in that house, and by sunrise, he'd wake up to a world where nothing he thought was his anymore. The night air was cool against my face as I wheeled myself toward the waiting taxi. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, quickly stepped out to help lift my suitcase into the trunk and fold my wheelchair into the back seat. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. I gave him the address of the international terminal and settled into the back, watching the house fade from view through the rear window. There was no hesitation in me anymore. That house, that street, even that city, all of it had become a cage I was now leaving behind without a trace. The roads were nearly empty, just the occasional delivery truck or night shift worker heading home. Every streetlight we passed felt like a checkpoint in my escape. I thought about all the years I had lived with the weight of being polite, of keeping the peace, of tolerating disrespect in the name of family. Tonight, I wasn't carrying that weight anymore. Tonight, I was just a woman moving forward. Halfway to the airport, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my lawyer, confirming that the buyer had received the keys earlier than expected. He was spending the night in a hotel nearby and planned to begin moving in tomorrow morning. By the time my son woke, there would be strangers in his driveway. The thought didn't make me smile. It just made me feel steady. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of spite. This was about balance, about reclaiming the respect he had thrown away when he kicked my wheelchair in front of a crowd. When we pulled up to the airport, the driver retrieved my chair and suitcase without a word. I paid him in cash and tipped him more than he expected. "Safe travels," he said softly before driving off. I wheeled myself inside, the terminal glowing with the kind of quiet energy that only exists in the middle of the night. Travelers moved slowly, dragging bags, sipping coffee, waiting for boarding calls. None of them knew my story. To them, I was just another passenger. That anonymity was comforting. At check-in, I handed over my passport and ticket. The agent glanced at me briefly, typed a few keys, and tagged my suitcase. She asked if I needed assistance boarding, and I nodded. An airport staff member soon arrived to guide me through security. The entire process felt like crossing into another chapter of my life. Every gate I passed, every corridor I moved down was a hallway leading away from the life I had known. While waiting near my gate, I took my phone out and scrolled through the unanswered calls from my son. There were none yet, which meant he was still asleep. The real chaos would start in a few hours, after the movers arrived. I pictured him running from room to room, seeing strangers unpacking boxes in what he thought was his home. I pictured the moment the lawyer told him the truth, that he had no legal claim to anything, that every wall, every piece of furniture, every inch of land now belonged to someone else. I didn't feel cruel for imagining it. I felt justified, because for years I had given him everything he needed to live well, to have comfort, to avoid the struggles I had endured. And in return, he had reduced me to a burden, something to be pushed, literally, out of his way. That push in the supermarket aisle had been the final reminder that kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be trampled. When boarding began, I was wheeled onto the plane first. My seat was by the window, and as I settled in, I looked out over the runway. The lights stretched into the distance like a path laid just for me. As the engines roared to life, I felt no fear, no sadness, just relief. By the time the wheels left the ground, my son was still in the dark, sleeping in a house that no longer belonged to him. And by the time he woke, I'd be halfway across the world, unreachable, untraceable, and finally, completely free. Morning light poured into his bedroom, the same way it had for years, but nothing else about that morning would feel familiar. My son woke late, stretching lazily before heading to the kitchen. He expected the quiet stillness of his home, the control he thought he owned over every inch of it. Instead, there was the muffled sound of voices. At first, he probably assumed it was the television. But then came the dragging of boxes, the thud of furniture against walls, and the low hum of strangers talking as if they belonged there, because now they did. When he stepped into the hallway, he found two men carrying his sofa toward the front door. A woman in jeans and a baseball cap stood nearby with a clipboard, giving instructions. She glanced at him the way you look at someone passing on the street. No recognition, no respect, just another face in the way. He barked out a demand to know what was going on, but his voice only earned a polite, "Excuse me, sir," as the movers brushed past him. Confusion turned to panic when he saw a family standing in the living room, the new owners. They had come early to measure the windows for curtains. The father extended a hand, trying to be cordial, but my son ignored it, his eyes darting around for any sign of me. There was none. Not my suitcase, not my chair, not even a note. It was the lawyer who delivered the blow. My son called my number over and over, each time going straight to voicemail. Then he saw the missed call from an unfamiliar number. When he returned it, my lawyer answered calmly, explaining the sale had been finalized, funds transferred, and keys handed over. The house was never in his name. Legally, he had no claim, no right to stay. He was instructed to remove any personal belongings before the end of the day. That's when the calls to me began. First, the angry ones, shouting into the phone about betrayal, about family, and everything I've done for you. Then came the pleading ones, promising to make it right if I just came back. I didn't answer any of them. His words meant nothing now. They were the same mouth that had laughed at me in that supermarket aisle, The same voice that told me to move faster, like I was blocking his life. Neighbors began to notice. Some peeked through blinds. Others came outside to watch the scene unfold. He was out on the lawn, pacing, phone pressed to his ear, while strangers moved his things into the driveway. No one stepped in to help him. No one offered sympathy. They had seen enough over the years to know that what was happening wasn't without reason. By afternoon, the movers were finished. His possessions sat in mismatched piles, clothes, electronics, and furniture now stripped of the walls that had once made them feel like his. The new owners closed the door behind them, leaving him standing outside with nowhere to go. That street, which he had always walked with the arrogance of someone who thought he'd never lose it, now felt small and unwelcoming. Somewhere far away, I sat in a quiet apartment overlooking the sea, my phone on silent. The lawyer had updated me earlier. The transfer was complete, and the sale couldn't be undone. I imagined him still calling, still pacing, still refusing to believe that I had walked away for good. But this was not a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in clarity. He had treated me like I was disposable. So I disposed of the life he thought I owed him. The news traveled quickly through the family. Some called to say I was cruel, others to say I was brave. But no opinion mattered now except my own. I had acted within my rights, and I had reclaimed my dignity. And just like that, the life he thought was permanent was gone overnight, because he forgot that the person he kicked aside was the one who put him there in the first place. The first night in my new place, I didn't set an alarm. I didn't need to. The sound of waves outside my window became my clock. I woke slowly, the morning sun spilling across the white curtains, the air smelling faintly of salt. My wheelchair sat beside my bed, not tucked away in some corner, not shoved behind furniture, right where I could reach it without asking anyone's permission. That alone felt like freedom. I rolled myself to the balcony, and for the first time in years, there was no one telling me to hurry. No voice sighing impatiently, no eyes rolling at my pace. Just me, the sea, and a warm cup of coffee that I brewed myself in my own kitchen. Every movement was my choice. Every sound in that apartment belonged to me. In the days that followed, I learned something strange. Silence can heal. Back in my son's house, silence was heavy, cold, a sign of distance. Here, it was gentle. I could sit for hours reading by the window without feeling like I was in someone's way. I could move at my own speed, whether it took me 5 minutes or an hour to do something. My worth was no longer measured by how quickly I could keep up. I even made friends. The woman in the apartment next to mine baked bread every Sunday and brought me a loaf still warm from the oven. The young man downstairs carried my groceries up without me having to ask, and not once did he make me feel like it was a chore. No pity in their eyes, just kindness. Sometimes I thought about my son. I wondered if he'd changed, if losing the house made him see the truth about how he'd treated me. But those thoughts didn't weigh me down anymore. I didn't leave to punish him. I left to save myself. The humiliation in that supermarket had been the final push, but the decision had been building for years. A person can only shrink themselves for so long before they disappear entirely, and I refused to vanish. Now every day feels like a quiet victory. I choose what I eat, where I go, who I speak to. My wheelchair isn't something for someone else to put up with. It's simply part of who I am, and here, that's respected. I don't have to prove my worth or fight for space. I already have both. And whenever the memory creeps in, that sharp kick in the aisle, the laughter, the sting of shame, I remember where I am now. I remember the look on his face when the life he thought was his crumbled in a single morning. Then I take another sip of coffee and smile, because he kicked my wheelchair in public, and I kicked him out of the life he thought he owned.